Thank you for joining me for this next installment in the Missing 411 Examined series. Today we are on the Kentucky section, which starts on page 225 of the book. Mercifully, this means that we are almost done, since the actual cases only go until page 283. We only have 3 more chapters after this one. I'm going to skip over the introduction of this chapter given in the book, since it's the same thing just about as in the last chapter. Up first is Eddie Prigley. Eddie, who was 3 years old at the time, went missing on August 22nd, 1874 from Cawthorsville, Indiana. Eddie was left alone in the house while his mother went outside for a few minutes. When she returned, he was gone. Volunteers immediately started searching. A severe storm hit the area that night and caused major flooding. When Eddie still wasn't found the next day, his mother tried to drown herself, but was saved by a friend. 76 hours after he disappeared, Eddie was found on the other side of the river, about 4 miles from his home. He was still alive, but just barely. The next part is really unnerving due to how he quoted the article from the New York Times, August 30th, 1874, that refers to Eddie as an it instead of he. Quote, "Its face was turned up and presented a pale and ghastly appearance. Warner went up to the poor little thing and took it in his arm. It moaned piteously, and it was nearly dead from fatigue, hunger, and exposure." Close quote. Eddie eventually recovered from his poor health. The article mentioned that the opposite side of the river was never searched, given that people did not believe that he could have made it across. Pilates agrees and says that the only way that Eddie could have crossed the river would be in a boat, since it was a river, not a creek. And to his credit, he does note that Eddie would not have been able to pilot a boat. Quote, "As I've stated in other cases, when children disappear, they often come across a creek or river somehow and probably with the aid of someone." Close quote. Before we actually look at the counterpoints here in review, I just have to ask, why? To what end does Pilates suggest that someone is helping these children cross rivers and creeks or get to them? I genuinely want to know. He's suggesting that someone is lurking around and they found Eddie outside. They picked him up and deposited him on the other side of the river, but did nothing else and left no evidence of their presence. Why? Anyway, let's carry on and see what we can find. Cawthorsville is about 34 miles north of the Kentucky border. I'm not sure why this is in the Kentucky section. And at point 2, there's already something a little off. As for point 2, the mother returned because the storm was already rolling in, which definitely would have hampered any searches. Volunteers didn't search immediately, they searched after his mother had already spent some time looking on her own. For the last points, an article that had the exact same quote that Pilates presented also has a section which explains the odd comments about not being able to pilot a boat. Quote, "How the child crossed the river is explained. On Saturday, the river was very low, and Mr. Prigley, owning a field across the stream, had a log raft constructed for passage to and from the field." Close quote. Now I know what you're thinking. A raft? Well, surely you aren't saying that a 3-year-old rowed across a river, in a storm no less. Well, no, I'm not saying that. Let's continue in the article. Quote, "The child frequently crossed the log bridge and must have done so that day." Close quote. So we already have clarification. Raft meaning log bridge, which the child had already demonstrated he had the capability of crossing on his own. Let's read just a little bit further. Quote, "Saturday night, the river rose 4 feet, completely covering the bridge. And after the little fellow got over, he was unable to find his way back." Close quote. Now I'm going to do a little bit of speculating. I know that it is extremely likely that Pilates read this exact same passage that I just did, and yet he chose to misreport this. I know that this is very likely because he quotes from the second half of this very same paragraph when he points out that the opposite bank wasn't searched. So we're left with three possibilities the way that I see it. 1. Paulides is being intentionally deceptive by cutting around the reasonable explanation. 2. Paulides has a serious reading comprehension issue that has prevented him from understanding the article, which makes this an honest mistake. Or 3. Paulides skims and skips around articles without actually reading the whole thing, his negligence causing the misinformation. I'll let you be the judge as to which one of those cases is the most likely. Ronnie Weitcamp. Ronnie, who was 3 years old at the time, went missing on October 11th, 1955, from Crane Depot, Indiana. This case is included in Kentucky because he went missing on nearly the same longitudinal line as the previous case. Ronnie's family lived on a naval depot that his father worked at. Ronnie was playing in a neighbor's yard when, without saying anything, he suddenly wandered into the thickets behind the house. Ronnie's friend told her mother about Ronnie leaving, and a search launched immediately. The Navy locked down the whole base, and thousands of military personnel searched with the aid of airplanes and helicopters. The Herald-Examiner reported that on the 14th, officials said that they were convinced that Ronnie had been kidnapped. Every home on the base was searched, as the Navy owned all of the buildings. 54 days after Ronnie went missing, his body was found in some tall weeds about 1.5 miles from his home. His body was badly decomposed, and his overalls were removed and sat about 6 feet away from his body. The coroner determined that Ronnie had scratches on his legs, meaning that he walked or was carried through the thickets without his overalls. He also determined that Ronnie had died of exposure. Paulides puts forth a theory about a conspiracy involving the FBI. Let's review. While yes, the case is close in longitude, it is still in Indiana and still more than 50 miles from the Kentucky border. What possible cause of disappearances could make longitude a significant factor? Let's not ignore the fact that these cases are more than 80 years apart from each other. Moving on, his friends were called in for lunch. When he was called in 15 minutes later, he wasn't there, and at that point, a friend said that he went off into the thicket. Next, we'll talk about the overalls being removed. This was completely discounted by investigators. Quote, Captain Dillon attached no importance to the fact that part of the child's clothing had been removed. He cited several cases of lost children removing their clothing, especially youngsters of only a few years old. Apparently, they associate taking off clothing with going to bed and disrobe when they become tired and sleepy. Close quote. Ronnie was also determined to have died within 24 hours of his disappearance. And finally, the thicket where he was found was described as having many small plum trees, which likely still had leaves on them when the searches were conducted. A search, by the way, which only lasted 3 days. There was no evidence of foul play when the scene was investigated. And while it was said that the place he was found was illogical, his presumed path was actually tracked by a bloodhound. The evidence all points to Ronnie wandering in a zigzag pattern, then crawling into a thicket to rest, then dying of exposure on the first day he went missing. Debbie Ann Greenhill. Debbie, who was 2 years old at the time, went missing on August 9th, 1958, from Olive Hill, Kentucky. Debbie and her family were in the midst of a move to a new property. She was playing alone on the side of her new rural house for 20 minutes. When her mother came to check on her, she was gone. The residence was searched for a while. Then, she called the sheriff, who in turn contacted the state police. 2 violent rainstorms hit immediately after Debbie's disappearance. Law enforcement said that they thought she had been kidnapped. They contacted the FBI for help, and the FBI offered their facilities and 4 agents, although there was no evidence of kidnapping at the time. The reservoir was dragged but turned up nothing. Bloodhounds failed to pick up the scent. On August 13th, a National Guard searcher heard a small girl crying about 3/4 of a mile away from the house. Debbie was found 150 feet from the reservoir with a berry-stained face, alive but crying. There are a bunch of statements in the book here that necessitate reading verbatim. Quote, Debbie Ann was examined by a pediatrician who gave the following statement to Park City News on August 13, 1958. Dr. William Schnitzker, Ashland pediatrician, said that she, Debbie Ann, must have lived on berries which grow thick and wild in the area. There was little evidence of malnutrition, although Debbie was very hungry. Debbie Ann had been missing for nearly 90 hours without food or water, and the doctor stated that she was in remarkable condition. How? The doctor also stated that Debbie had lots of cuts and abrasions. An article in the August 14, 1958 Charleston Gazette stated, the child was naked, her blonde curls matted and body scratched, bruised, and insect bitten. She was declared in remarkably good condition. Close quote. Lastly, this question is posed in the book. Quote, Debbie had moved to her new residence the day she disappeared. How did she know that the berries in the area were edible? Close quote. An equally humorous statement is made later on. Quote, berries seem to be involved in many of these missing person cases. Close quote. Let's try to unpack these statements in the review. I didn't see any information about the time frame that she went missing, nor rain in the area. Law enforcement also noted that there's no evidence to support the idea of kidnapping besides their failure to locate her in searches. I think that the FBI has shown themselves in previous cases to be mostly cooperative when it comes to searches of young children. And she was actually found while the National Guard was dragging the reservoir, as she was close to it at the time. There were 2 searchers that found her, and it was 80 hours, not 90. And let's finally break down the ridiculous statements made in the book. First, it stated that she ate berries. Then says that she was without food or water. Then it's asked how she was in remarkable condition, then quotes several injuries that she had. It doesn't take a rocket scientist to assume that the doctor meant that she was in remarkable condition considering that she was alive and talking. Any level of function would be remarkable given the amount of time that she was missing. Further, she clearly was not without food or water, considering that she was near the reservoir and also had clear evidence of eating the berries. As for the last point, I actually laughed out loud when I read this line for the first time. A 2-year-old doesn't think about what is edible or not. Anyone with kids should know that young children have a horrible tendency to try and eat just about anything. Even my own sister once took a bite out of a bike seat. Debbie was hungry. Debbie saw delicious-looking berries. Debbie ate those berries. It would shock me if the idea of them being poisonous even crossed her little 2-year-old brain once. For the second part, berries come up so often because that's what your average person is capable of harvesting for food in the wilderness. What's the implication here? What a ridiculous point. Pilates didn't mention that the child didn't ever say what happened to her when she was missing like he usually does. That should be a red flag by now. See, she told searchers that she had just been walking around the whole time that she was missing. So there was no kidnapping, which is the predominant theory pushed in the book. She was just walking around by her own admission. Last, we have Frank Downey. Frank, who was 4 years old at the time, went missing on August 16, 1999, from the stamping ground in Scott County, Kentucky. The area, like others, is very rural. Around 8:30 p.m., Frank somehow got the front door open and wandered out with 2 German shepherds. This was odd because it was very nearly dark. His mother immediately searched and called her husband, then called police. The sheriff launched a 1-mile radius search, believing that Frank could not have traveled further due to his age. The next morning, Frank was found alive and well with his 2 dogs by a neighbor about 3 miles from his home. He had scratches on his feet from not wearing shoes. Pilates asked how he got so far, since search professionals believed that he could only travel 1 mile, as opposed to the 3. Quote, "It just so happens to be the approximate date that berries become ripe in this area of the country." Close quote. This last comment just blows me away. Up until this point, my impression of Missing 411 was damaged by the inaccuracies and narrative pushing, but we have truly reached an absurd level. Pilates is seriously suggesting that berries have an active role in making people disappear. Are the berries sentient now? Do they call out to the children and seduce them into the woods? I'm sure that this has been coming across in my videos. I try very hard not to let this be the case. But I am becoming increasingly frustrated by this book, and it's becoming increasingly hard to make videos on them just by the sheer absurdity inside. Let's look at the facts. It's not odd at all that Frank wandered out. The family stated that he frequently went outside on his own to play in the hills and valleys near his home. In fact, this was so common that the sheriff had filed a complaint, the equivalent of child services at the time, to have the Downeys investigated for child negligence. As to when he went missing, who knows? This could have been at any time, and I never saw any source that cited a specific time. As for how he got so far, Frank had followed a 1-lane county road for at least part of his journey, which would definitely have contributed to the distance covered. I don't think I would call an elected official, the sheriff, a search professional. Frank was 4, and the sources that Pilates himself cites, in other cases, say that the search radius should have been much wider. Second, officials at the time recognized this and just said, quote, "He got a little further than most," close quote, which is perhaps the most casual whoops I've ever heard. As for the last ridiculous point about the berries, it's not even accurate. It's not when berries become ripe in Kentucky. Berries become ripe in the summer, usually in June, and August is either too late or one of the very last months to get the berries. And that brings us to the end of Kentucky, which really should have been called Kentucky and Indiana. Thank you very much for watching. Until next time, take care.